Great. So I'm really pleased to welcome Ashley Frawley to the very first of a new series of podcasts on therapeutic cultures and scholars who do research on therapeutic cultures. And Ashley is a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University in Wales. She's done a lot of important research on therapeutic cultures, including her 2015 book, Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, published by Bloomsbury, and her forthcoming Significant Emotions, Rhetoric and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age, also due to be published by Bloomsbury. So that's a very brief introduction. And now over to you, Ashley. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? How would you describe yourself as a scholar?
Yeah, that was a fairly good introduction, right? So I'm a lecturer, obviously, in sociology and social policy, and my main area of research, and which is included in those books, is looking at the way that emotion functions in social problems. And by that, I don't mean the way that we're being asked to feel indirectly. So some people will do research on, for instance, the culture of fear and the way that we're being encouraged to be afraid of a particular thing, right? But the focus is on that thing that we're supposed to be afraid of. That's a very interesting area of research. But what I'm interested in is how particular emotions themselves become problematized, become set up as social problems about which governments, institutions, a range of what I call, and what social problem theorists call claims makers, and a variety of entrepreneurs and companies that get, and basically a whole market that springs up around these new emotion problems. So that's what my research mainly looks at. My first book looked at happiness in particular, how that came to be scientized or set up as a scientific phenomenon about which you have to have specialized expertise. The main claim in that, one of the big claims in that problem formation or formulation, was that everyday people don't have the capacity to be happy without some kind of intervention. They need to be taught how to be happy. And then this, of course, opens up a whole new area for scholarship and expertise and products and self-help books. And once you kind of create a problem, it's a bit like, if you really can't sell people deodorant unless you tell them first you smell bad. It's like that kind of idea that first you create an issue and then you create the means by which it can be solved. So that's what I'm interested in. I looked at happiness first, and now I'm looking at the connections between a lot of very similar problems. So when I finished that 2015 book, I started to notice that there were previous problem formations that were very similar, like self-esteem in the 80s and 90s, and that happiness was sort of waning and giving way to something else, which was well-being, and then well-being was kind of giving way to mental health, and then within that there were all these little cycles like mindfulness, these little sort of smaller problem formations that also kind of merged and piggybacked off of the power of the happiness problem, or the well-being problem, or the mental health problem. So that's what I'm interested in, how that comes about, the markets that spring up around it, the connections between claims makers, and kind of why this is all happening. That's really my research.
That's really interesting, and there's so much in what you've just said that we should talk about later on. But to begin with, on the one hand, what I think you're doing with your research is something very classically sociological, in that you take something familiar, that's something that forms part of contemporary common sense, the notion of happiness, and defamiliarize it, and ask how it has become what it is in contemporary society and in contemporary culture, as well as in contemporary politics. But the question still remains, how did you get to this? How did you become interested in this subject matter? How would you describe your intellectual formation as a scholar?
As a few kind of paths converged. When I was when I was a teenager, I had a very difficult time, as teenagers do, but I think my time might have been slightly more difficult. And I remember going to a counselor at my high school, which is what I remember as a good citizen. That's what you do. You're feeling bad, you go to a professional. So, and I remember kind of hinting that something terrible was going on. Not that terrible. I mean, like, I know it's not the suffering Olympics. Like, people have had much worse lives than I had. But at any rate, that, you know, I was, my home situation was not good. And I noticed that as I was talking, the counselor wasn't really listening to me. She was going through this checklist. And then at the end of it, she goes, I think, you know, it's not your fault. You've got a chemical imbalance in your brain. You have depression. And at first I was like, you know, I felt this relief. Oh, it's, you know, this is a very common experience that people have when they get this kind of diagnosis or suggested diagnosis. They feel this feeling of relief. And I initially felt that. And then my skepticism began to come in. I thought, no, I don't actually think there's something wrong with my brain. I think that I need like a nice home with parents in it and some direction in my life. And I was self-aware enough to realize that. So I was always a little bit skeptical of this sort of thing. But nonetheless, I was very much immersed in therapeutic culture. And when I went to university, you know, I really felt this sense of normlessness. And because I didn't really have any parents and I didn't have any direction, I was looking for a rule book. You know, you just tell me who I'm supposed to be, how I'm supposed to behave, how I'm supposed to act, what is right and wrong, this sense of like contemporary normlessness. And where did I find it? I found it in self-help books. And I noticed over time that it was making me really neurotic. Like, I was thinking all the time, you know, I put these little affirmations up on my wall, like, don't save your happiness up for the future, be happy now. And I would think, like, why can't I just be happy? And then in my final year of university, I took a seminar called Advanced Sociology of Mental Health, run by Jeffrey Stepniewski, who still lots of respect. It was a wonderful, wonderful seminar. And I came across Frank Furedi's book, Therapy Culture. And when I read this, it was like, you know, I realized that all of these things I've been told, you know, as a good citizen, this is how you're supposed to behave. You're supposed to be thinking about your feelings all the time. And that is how you're going to be good and healthy and so on. And I realized all these things had a history. But the way that it comes to you through the culture is as though it's this, you know, a science as hard as rocks. It's through scientific discovery that we have come to this form of subjectivity, this ideal. And to see it broken down historically, and to see actually some of its nefarious history in like eugenics and things like that, I was incensed. I felt that I had been lied to. And it's also amazing because when I read that book, all of my neuroticism dissipated because I realized that I didn't have to be thinking about my feelings all the time, which is what I had been told, you know, and I began to focus on a project beyond myself. I became immersed in scholarly projects after that. You know, I went to grad school and so on. And so that's how I sort of came to it, was through this sort of this natural kind of skepticism I had that was always sort of at the back of my mind. And then someone who kind of put words to it and put a history to it. And then just being involved in the project of understanding where this all came from. Ironically, is very fulfilling at the same time as it is also, you know, doing scholarship, doing a PhD, writing books and so on. It's also very, very difficult. But when you are immersed in something that matters and that gives you meaning, that difficulty and that suffering has meaning. If your life has no purpose and the only purpose in your life is your own internal feelings, that anchor meaning is inside, as opposed to in future or in some other project, life becomes unbearable because any little hurdle, you're constantly focused on your own internal psychology, right? And so any little hurdle, any bad feeling becomes a problem that you focus on quite a lot, as opposed to a problem that you're quite likely to overcome in pursuit of something else. Yeah, so that's kind of my whole intellectual history there.
Yes, that's very clear. And you've already mentioned some of the scholars who've contributed to setting you on this trajectory, for example, Frank Furedi. Are there any other major inspirations, any other major scholars who've had an influence on who you've become as an intellectual? What are your main?
Yeah, initially I was very interested in Foucault. I think as a lot of people are, became very powerful form of sort of Foucauldian critique became very powerful within the academy. And so, you know, Nicholas Rose and Michel Foucault were my initial sorts of people that whose work I would use. I've kind of moved away from that a bit, but it's still there in the back of my mind. I also remember sitting in a seminar as an undergraduate and learning about the Hegelian dialectic for the first time. It was another kind of experience. And that's always, funny thing about Hegel's work is that about once a year, I will do a deep dive into one text. So last year I was reading the lectures on religion, and I will never remember anything like in particular. Like I'll remember like a little quote or something like that. But the way that Hegel kind of works for me, it's like it's become the way that I think about things. I'm always thinking about sort of the vulgar thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's become the way that I think, having been exposed to it at like 19 years old. And so naturally, when I then started to read the work of Karl Marx, I gravitated toward that. So obviously, Marx's work is really, really influential in what I do. And I feel like the way that another sort of target for me sometimes is what I think of as vulgar Marxism, which is the tendency to take everything ready-made as though you already know what it is, right? Capitalism, mental illness, this sort of like vulgar dialectic or something, you know, this where it's like, oh yeah, you know, I'm doing a Marxist critique. I'm taking capitalism and saying capitalism causes mental ill health. No, all history must be studied afresh. So you can't just think that you know what capitalism is. There's change and flux. I think that the law of value is at the heart of capitalism, and that's not changed. But I think that how it actually, it's very hard to get down through culture all the way to the base. You can't start with the base and assume that you know how culture flows out of that. It's the wrong way around. And by the same token, you can't just take a cultural form ready-made. You have to study what it is. So a lot of people would, for like the happiness issue, people would take, oh, you know, suddenly the headlines are talking about happiness. Well, it must be because people became very, very unhappy. Capitalism is making everyone unhappy. It's a very powerful narrative. It speaks to people to a certain extent. There's a kind of sense of enemy and meaninglessness, right? And it gives voice to that, and it sounds very countercultural. But why did happiness get to the headlines? It's not because people suddenly became very, very unhappy. In fact, according to claims makers themselves, nothing had changed. That was the thing they singled out as a problem. That happiness surveys since the 1940s show that people are just as happy as they've ever been. Now, on its own, that doesn't really tell us much, right? You ask somebody on the street now, hey, how are you? They say, fine, thanks. And it's the same as 1950. What are we actually getting at there? We don't quite know. But put that on a graph with GDP, and suddenly you have a very powerful narrative. In spite of huge growth in GDP, we are no happier. Except that, now that's again another very powerful claim, but then put that on a graph of like female empowerment. You know, since 1948, women have much, much more freedom. Well, we're no happier. Ladies, back to the kitchen. You know, nobody says that. And so for me, the question became, why did those claims in particular become so powerful? And so I answered by saying there's this kind of like romantic anti-capitalism in the culture. And also from Marx, that's from the Grundrisse, where he talks about romanticism being capitalism's legitimate antithesis, which will be with it up to its blessed end.
That's very interesting. And another important point of reference, I think, in your work that shines through in what you've just explained is the sociology of social problems. Would you like to say a little bit more about that, how that has inspired your thinking?
Oh,
and come into
absolutely.
your work?
Absolutely. So the main sort of theoretical framework that I use is social problems constructionism, which is a form of contextual constructionism. And so I know that social constructionism gets a bad rap in the online culture war. But I think that actually, if you study that culture war, again, you actually have to study it. You can't really take it thinking you know what it is. I feel like constructionism doesn't really play as much of a role as people think it does. There's a kind of weird scientism. Even the most seemingly profoundly anti-scientific movements use what they claim to be science to justify what they're talking about. So I use contextual constructionism, which is a kind of similar form to critical realism. So basically, yes, there is a real world out there, but between our attempts to understand that world, there is a whole world of culture and so on. And it's trying to understand how the categories that we use to try to grasp that world can be influenced by our taken for granted understandings of what it means to be human that exists at a particular time in a particular culture, what we call ethno-psychology, can be influenced by what seems possible and just pragmatic in terms of the economic formations of society. You know, for most people, capitalism as the context of our lives is normal and natural and simply an outgrowth of human nature or nature. And so that kind of puts a box around what we will talk about, what we think is possible. Now, of course, the question that you get is, sorry, I've got my email open. Close that. So, of course, the question that you get when you do that kind of research is, why are you outside of culture? Why are you able to see it? And the answer is the dialectic, but also the answer is I'm not. And it is my interpretation. What I do is colored also by my own intellectual background and my own hope and belief that capitalism is a transient system, and therefore when I see something that I think aligns with the way the system is, you know, I will say that's not the only way that we can talk about things. And I think that might be the only thing that's different between me and, you know, someone else looking at, you know, a person on the street who reads a newspaper. You don't know the whole background to how that headline was produced and why it became powerful and why it was put on the front page and so on. And of course, it's my interpretation of why that's happened. And that's kind of what scholarship is all about. You can disagree with my interpretation and offer your own, and we can have a bit of an argument.
So would you say that your perspective on your subject matter, your perspective on happiness and the intellectual resources on which you draw for it, Hegel, Marx, social problems theory, social constructionism, do you think that your perspective reflects current intellectual trends in the social sciences, in academia as well as in public life, or do you think that your scholarship in a way runs counter to these intellectual trends, towards currently fashionable in the social sciences, fashionable in sociology, intellectually fashionable in public life?
Given the amount of flack that I get, I would say probably quite unfashionable, and a lot of people don't really know how to place me politically because my understanding of capitalism is, I don't just negate capitalism. I don't just say, oh, it's a bad system, let's do away with it. I'm trying to understand what it is. And capitalism is a progressive force as well as a regressive force, that it's riddled with contradictions. And the things that push us forward are hampered by the things that pull us back. And there's this tug war going on. And I worry that those regressive forces, which will drag us back into like neo-feudal kind of forms, I worry that those will take over. And so but sometimes when people think of anti-capitalism, they think that anything that appears to negate what I think capitalism is must be good. So if we're talking about, like, for instance, one of the things that I talk about in my 2015 book is degrowth rhetoric. and the whole idea of slow growth and or no growth or zero growth and all that stuff. And people say, well, isn't capitalism just about growth? So then if I say we shouldn't have any growth, aren't I being anti-capitalist? Well, actually, no. From that perspective, an economic crisis isn't this horrible, destructive thing. It's this wonderful thing. Let's just have crisis. Like, no, it creates horrible, horrible outcomes for human beings. We don't have socialism just sitting up, like communism just waiting. Oh, you know, we'll just have communism. Like we don't have a movement in society that's just waiting to be taken up, right? So when you have an economic crisis, people get thrown out of work. It's an extraordinary volatile time. You have the conditions that are created for like inter-imperialist war. I mean, if you look at crises throughout history, the vast majority of them, and when I say throughout history, I mean throughout capitalist history, the vast majority of them end with a reset of some sort, some kind of enormous destructive event, a war of some kind. There was the Yukon Gold Rush is an exception, but for the most part, they end with war. That's terrifying. So yes, capitalism grows, but it also can't grow. It comes up against limits or fetters to its own growth. And that growth is actually a good thing for humanity, or it could be a good thing for humanity if we were doing it for use value, for the betterment of human beings and human lives. We don't do that. That's not why capitalism grows. It's not to make our lives better. It is a self-expanding capital. It has to try to expand. At the same time, it can't. So we have a falling rate of profit, we have periodic crises, and as people try to push past those crises to bring about another boom, we have extraordinary destruction. And so I don't see like championing one-sidedly those regressive kind of forces as anti-capitalist. You have to understand both sides and that push and pull and that what are we going toward. And if we do not take hold of the progressive side of capitalism, that regressive side could easily win. We could have like a managed decline toward something terrible. Like this is what I'm thinking about right now. And this is a new project that I may open up. So it's just like little germs of ideas that I'm talking about. But I do think that regressive side may be winning out at the moment. There are very few people who champion progress, growth, abundance, use values, human consumption. And that's why people think of me as a right winger, which I think is a perfectly Marxist position to have. It's the basis of communism. So the USSR was trying to create, and failed miserably, but that's what they were trying to do. This basis of abundance that would give us the freedom that rich people, a lot of rich people just have, right? They can work if they want to, but they don't have to. Well, we want that for everybody. Well, that is no longer really championed, and this kind of like holding back, restrain your consumption, moral people find happiness within. I find that to be actually very regressive. That's that regressive side of capitalism. Workers, you must not consume, right? Like I don't go on a picket line begging my employer to pay me less. I want more. That's what movements have been about, right? And so this whole ideology that says no, you must moderate your desires is perfectly fitting within capitalism. Only in the last kind of half century where we have this idea that capitalism is all about making everybody richer, which is terrible. If that was the only problem with capitalism, I wouldn't fight it so much. It's a terrible system. It makes everybody so rich, bad for our souls. No, it's a terrible system because it will toss us out. It doesn't give us any freedom to be what we want to be. It gives us a little hint of freedom, like that this world of like wealth and culture, where maybe I don't have to, like I can be a sociologist, but I don't have to, I can do sociology, but I don't have to be a sociologist. I can do all sorts of other things. The world that rich people take for granted and have taken for granted throughout history to be Renaissance men and so on, that world for everybody is within our reach. We can't have it. We can't quite have it. And my question is, how can we have it? How can we get there? And so to be that kind of, have that kind of progressive look at the world and the future and that hope for a better future, I think is very iconoclastic at the moment and very countercultural and sounds very right wing, but I think it is very much in keeping with the general thrust of the left since really the 18th century, the end of the 18th century.
Sure. And What's noteworthy in this context is, I think, your use of the term progress, which again has a long history, a long tradition in the intellectual context to which you've referred, but which also for some time now has been quite controversial. So what do you mean by progress, and why do you use the term progress to refer to this kind of positive vision for social and personal development that you describe?
I would say that for me, progress is anything that releases human beings from the fetters of their desires. I know that desire in itself is socially constructed and depends upon the particular context of your life. But with capitalism, we get that. Like, part of the reason why we have the idea of liberal subjectivity is because its possibility emerged. So it became possible in the 19th century to be a liberal subject, that is free-willing, rational, capable of reflecting on your feelings and acting and judging and being part of a democratic process, all of that stuff. Again, socially constructed. You could have all sorts of different ways of being a subject, right? That kind of subjectivity became possible, but not fully possible. That the economic base of society was not mature enough to give it full expression, which is why it was only given expression in small little fits and starts. So people who were better able to exercise it, people who had money and so on, initially were given a vote, and it gradually moved out to the rest of the population. I think that is progressive in the sense that I think it is a movement toward freedom, where I can, throughout human history, human beings were more or less determined by their social context. So in the 11th century, you were, born a peasant, you died a peasant. Maybe the 11th century is a bad example, 12. But in the medieval times, during feudalism, that you were more or less determined. You couldn't just, go and become something else. Oh, I'm going to go be, a singer or something. To a certain extent, those things were closed off from you. Capitalism threw the peasants off the land and allowed them freedom to go and work for whatever capitalist would take them. As Oscar Wilde said, so free indeed, they were free to starve. But there's that little incremental bit of freedom where you don't have to be whatever your birth dictated. And I call that progress. Now, I think that a lot of people don't think that, obviously, I know a lot of people don't think of that as progressive. When I say it is progressive, I'm making an argument that it is. I'm not saying it just de facto is. It's my argument. I'm saying we should follow that through. We should use our agency to create that world. And if you want that world too, follow me. But a lot of people will say, no, I don't want that world. And I do understand that, because again, it's this, what you did have when you had tradition that dictated your life, you had a script, and you didn't have, you wouldn't have had an intellectual crisis at the age, existential crisis at the age of like 16, like, oh, who am I meant to be? What is my place in the world? Because you would have known that. You would have known that because you'd see what your mother was and your grandmother and so on. And actually, I think if you look at Disney movies, I've got two small children, and so I've been watching a lot of Disney movies over and over and over and over again. And what I have noticed is that Disney movies all seem to be playing out this central tension of modernity, which is the pull of the past, tradition. You just know what you're going to be. Come on, Belle, marry this man. That's what women do. Moana, it's time you knew. The village is all you need. The tradition is here. It'll give you a script. That's who you're supposed to be. And the call of freedom, of self-determination, and also the risk and the danger of that. And there's this constant, and Disney is obviously on the side of self-determination and so on. And you can say, oh, well, capitalism, let's just negate that. But we don't have that. We don't actually fully have that freedom. We see its possibility, but we don't fully have it. You want to be a singer? Okay, you can be a singer if a capitalist will pay you enough, right? Or if you can get a contract. If you can be alienated from that skill, good. But the question is, how can we have that freedom without the alienation? Is that possible? Can I just create something without it being taken from me and sold as a commodity? Is that possible? How do we do that? How do we bring together subject and object? And what people will often do is they'll reject objectification in and of itself. That is, reject the creation of a commodity, reject commodities, and retreat into subjectivity. Retreat into my feelings, myself. That's where I'm going to find meaning. But again, that's one-sided. That's a one-sided rejection of creativity and objects, and how human beings put themselves into objects, and to a certain extent have always done so, at least according to Marx and Engels. So I understand that. Also, I'm Ojibwe, and I do feel like I feel a loss at the loss of culture. My grandmother was probably one of the last people who was a native speaker of Ojibwe. She didn't teach, like my grandparents didn't teach their children Ojibwe. And I remember that culture, and I love powwows and the way that life is on the reserve, and I feel a longing for that, and I do understand the pain of its loss, and that sense of when that I know that kind of romantic desire that people have, and that longing for a past when they think everything was clear and we knew how to live. And you can see that in a lot of discourses that emerge about Indigenous people. But you simply can't go back. And there's a very good line in the Gundry Set where Marx says, it is as ridiculous to long for that original wholeness as it is to imagine with this complete emptiness all history has come to a standstill. We can't go back. We can't maintain the present indefinitely. We have to understand the forces of change. And if we can understand them, maybe we can bend them to our will. And that, I think people will say, oh, that's hubris and so on, but that's our only choice. Cat's out of the bag, genie's out of the bottle. The only option that we have is, as human beings, to understand the forces of change and to attempt to bend those to our will and try to win people over to our side for what our will is. That is, I think, what I call progress, which is trying to lay the foundation for a human freedom where we can choose what we want to be, where we can take hold of objects, and by that I mean seize the means of production, where we can get rid of that alienation and have a direct relationship somehow with what we produce, and produce for human need and for use values. It is possible. Capitalism has given us that possibility. We just don't know how to do it. We just don't know how to do it. We don't know how to organize things without the market. Maybe one day we will.
Good. That's quite a clear argument, and also a very sophisticated argument. Now, one thing that I would say distinguishes your scholarship is that you don't only engage with other academics, you're also very much a public scholar. So how do you engage quite a variety, I would say, of non-academic audiences in this very sophisticated reasoning about freedom and progress and modernity, and for that matter, happiness?
I don't know how sophisticated it is. I think that I used to be much more sophisticated. Like when I was a grad student, I actually think that through engaging with a broader range of people, I've let go a little bit of that, and I'm still kind of wondering if that's a good thing. But I have very little patience now for people who don't write clearly, for example. So I'm on the editorial board of Zero Books, and we get a lot of manuscripts. I shouldn't say this, but it's like an affliction of grad students. And I say this with great affection because I was one of these grad students as well, where you write so obscurely. And I know because you're trying to be precise, but it is a wonderful skill to be able to write clearly and to explain to people in a way that you could explain to anyone. Anything that is worth talking about can be explained to anyone. You just have to find a way to do it. So I that's been my mission, really. And actually, it's not a mission that grew organically out of myself. I've got a friend who is a big fan of my work and is very encouraging, helps me with stuff like that. And I remember I did like a TV interview once, and he watched it and he called me up and he was like, that was terrible. and I thought it was really good. I was very precise and I was very careful about what I said. And I talked about the research, how the research had changed and all the different possibilities. And he said, nobody understood that. What was the point? what was the point of talking? You had an opportunity to talk to 50,000 people and you talked to 5. Why would you do that? And that was really like a wake-up call for me. And so now I always think like, and it's hard because you let go of a lot of nuance. And I find that very difficult because you want to say like, not all people, some people, particularly these groups, and within those groups, there's quite a bit of variation. But when you talk to a broader audience, you have to say, you have to, and it's so hard to do that. But you've got to do it, or there's no point. There's no point. Like, and I try to get this to my grad students as well, my PhD students. I would say like, look, could you explain this to your girlfriend or boyfriend, or your partner? And they say, oh, they wouldn't understand that. Well, why not? Why are you writing this in a way that they can't understand it? And for sometimes I realize it's a little bit of intellectual dishonesty with myself, that I want to make an argument that I think is really risky. And I'm scared to make the argument. And so what I'll do is I will be very technical, and it's not that I'm consciously doing this, right? I'll be very technical and very careful because I know it's a risky argument, so I want to make it carefully. But then I'm actually just not coming out and saying what I really think. And I think that's the hardest thing, because when you do that, you expose yourself. And you expose yourself to criticism because people can understand clearly what you're saying. And that's really hard. But only through that kind of criticism and defending your ideas and defending them clearly, and also putting them right down to earth. This is what it means for everyday life. This is what it means for your life. This is what it means for policy or whatever. It really forces you to defend your ideas and be sure that you're right. And also let go of some ideas if they're wrong. But if no one ever engages with you because you've written in such an obscure way, or you talk in such an obscure way, you never really progress.
Of course, I certainly agree with what you just explained, but let me ask a follow-up question nevertheless. Why bother? Why bother with this kind of public engagement and the kinds of challenges it poses? Why not engage with just with your core academic audience, the people who appreciate abstract, sophisticated, complex arguments in the way in which they are written? Why not just limit yourself to, let's say, the 5 out of 50,000 in an audience who are academics, work in the same field as you look for and read your academic publications and leave it at that. There are certainly many academics and many sociologists who build their careers like that. Why and how has this public engagement become an important part of who you are as a scholar?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes question myself because when you speak clearly, people will assume that, or if you just try to teach people basic concepts, not teach people, I hate that word, disseminate basic concepts in a way that is very clear, people will assume that you have no intellectual basis. So people will say that you're very basic. And that if you use lots of very difficult and complex language, people will think, oh, well, you must be very smart. And so that's really hard. And it's hard to think, to know that people think that there isn't any intellectual substance to what I do. And maybe there isn't, maybe, if what I'm saying clearly leads people to that deeper work that I try to do, and they try to engage with that, I think that's really good. But I think that there are levels of what you do. So an idea can be explained clearly, right? But there's something underneath it. And I think the point of academic work and the point of scholarship and the point of engaging with just those 5-10 people is that you are carrying on that conversation and developing the deeper kind of scaffolding for your ideas, making sure that they are strong, correct, well thought out, evidenced, based on something. There's some kind of substance there. And that's the point of that. And that kind of deeper scholarly debate is very important. I value it very much. There was a time when I think everybody goes through this. You submit a paper, the very first paper you submit, and you get the peer reviews back, and you just want to it's terrible. And now I love it. I hate it when I get peer review that I don't think is good quality. When I want someone to really go through my work, and honestly, and just for me, and tell me how to improve it, so that I have the chance to make my work better. I think that's really, really important, and there's a place for that in society. But on top of that, there's also public engagement. And if you try to take that like form of communication out of the sphere where it belongs, and you try to put it into a public sphere, that it's not fit for purpose. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. That sphere is rhetoric. It's the sphere of trying to convince people as well. Now, there has to be some substance there, but you also have to be able to convince people on that. And I remember one of the very first texts that I read of Marx's was Wage, Labor, and Capital, Marx and Engels, was Wage, Labor, and Capital. And in the introduction, Marx and Engels write, we will not presuppose even the most elementary knowledge of political economy. We want to be understood by the workers. And I always remember that line because I don't want to just preach to the choir. I don't want to just talk to people who are already convinced. Why? Why do I want to talk to people who already supposedly are on my side? When I talk to people who are on my side, I'm like, we will develop ideas and so on. But when I'm talking to a broad audience, I want to convince people. I want to convince people who think that Marxism is about like Stalinism, or who think that the left is all about trying to get them fired. I want to engage, and I want to say, no, that's not what this is about. This is about making your life better. And if it's not about that, you're not on my side. And I want to talk to people. I want to talk to people in their homes. I want to be able to be understood by someone like my mother, who, has zero political understanding. And when she found out I was a communist, started spouting like weird McCarthyite stuff. And I was like, whoa, where did this come from? It's just like this remnant of an older propaganda age. I want to be able to jolt people out of that and convince people. I want to convince her that I'm on her side. I want to convince my husband. Like, my husband is, Amazon factory worker. I want to be able to talk to him. And if I can't convince him, having him in my house is probably the most important thing. Because I will often be like, he'll ask me a question and say, no, it's this and this and this, and no education, and he'll say, no, Ashley, you're wrong because of that. And I'll realize I'm completely wrong. And I've made this big intellectual argument, but I've just missed the point completely. He's there, he's working on the world and frustrated by the barriers. And I want to be able to convince him and get him on side. It helps that he's like a old style working class kind of communist himself, but at the same time, he just wants what's best for his family. And I think, and he wants a little bit of freedom. And I think that's what a lot of people want. And I want to be able to talk to those people.
That's, I think, a really strong case for public sociology, the way in which you've just explained it. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of your key works. First of all, your book, The Semiotics of Happiness. Would you like to say a little bit about the book, what it is about, why you wrote it?
Sure. So that book was my PhD thesis. So there are lots of marks of a PhD thesis in it, although I did spend 2 years rewriting it and developing some of the ideas in it. But I had very little confidence in myself, so it's over-referenced. It's hugely over-referenced. I recognize that. There are worse things that you can do. At that time, I didn't really have the confidence to just say what I thought. I had to go and find somebody and say what I thought through their mouth. And I think a lot of graduate students, a lot of early career researchers are like that. So it's obviously, it has the marks of an early kind of work. But at the same time, it was a really kind of in-depth study of newspaper discourses, but also it started with newspaper discourses and then kind of branched out to identify like key claims makers and initiatives and policy and so on. And I read, I don't even know how. So I sampled and analyzed in depth about 500 articles from a larger database that I created of over 1,000.
Mm.
But I've read, I think, at least 20,000 articles from the New York Times, you know, the major broadsheets in the UK, and Washington Post and New York Times in the United States. I from the New York Times, I must have, and I went into the microfilm too, which was very, very time consuming. But I found some very interesting things by doing that. So, for example, there was an initial attempt to problematize happiness by Lyndon Johnson. So he actually did try to take this very marginal, which was social indicators research at the time, this very marginal kind of subjective understanding of progress. He did try to put that at the forefront of a political kind of project, and he was just roundly mocked, just absolutely mocked for it. And he was mocked even by people who were initially on board, and then felt the pulse of the times and started turning around and going, "Oh, no! How can we talk about happiness when people are still starving? How can we talk about?" And they specifically said, "Look, you know, we need material gains here." And it's interesting that fell on deaf ears at the time. Whereas in 2003, it became very powerful. Well, what was the difference? Well, lots of differences, obviously. There's no monocausal explanation. But I think it's very interesting that in the interim, we had the sort of end of history, end of ideology. You know, large-scale social change was, you know, dead in the water. There's no communist movement really anymore, no trade union movements and so on. And so most people have been more or less convinced that material progress or material change or making people's lives materially better or even enabling consumerism, most people think that is like a right-wing kind of thing. They think that that's not good. And so that is one of the areas, one of the sort of foundations of the context that was hospitable to the construction of happiness as a problem in the early 2000s as opposed to the 60s and 70s. And that's just one thing. And then many, many other things that I try to explain there in that book for why. But it's interesting that it didn't become, I think the main argument that I try to make in that book is that we didn't start talking about happiness because everybody became very unhappy. We started talking about happiness because of certain aspects of social organization, cultural context, economic context, and political context.
Yes, and you make that very clear in your book towards the end when you argue that material structural explanations for human problems, to quote, have fallen out of favor, and to quote again that instead individual biological and neurological explanations, so explanations of human life and change and social problems that are rooted in biology and psychology and the neural sciences are what drives our understanding of the key issues of our times. I think that this is also an argument that points to the way in which, let's say, the balance of public debate and the balance of academic debate in the social sciences has shifted away from sociology, away from sociological explanations of human life, much more towards individualistic explanations, biological explanations grounded in biological, physiological processes and in our mental life. So how to put this, how to reactivate sociology, how to recover the sociological project? What are the kinds of steps to be taken through our scholarship and through our public engagement to make distinctively sociological understandings of, say, happiness and of other social problems more visible, more intelligible again?
I think we need to repoliticize economics, the economic sphere, the economic base of society, because one of the, I think, huge successes against progressive politics has been the depoliticization of economics. Through, I think, Thatcher, through neoliberalism. That's really been one of the most powerful results of that movement, if you can call it that, has been to say, okay, look, you know, the sphere of your contestation is culture. You can make your little cracks in culture, have your little carnivals against capitalism, have your little parties, fine, we'll let that happen to a certain extent. We'll crack down if you bust up a car. You can have that, right? But take your hands off the economic sphere. That's not for you. That's not for political contestation. And I think that the whole idea of politicizing happiness and mental health is another outgrowth of that. You worry about you. You worry about your feelings. That's the real thing that's going on here. What we're really talking about is happiness. What we're really talking about is mental health. And you worry about you. And here's a great, eat it slowly and think about it. It's mindfulness, like eat a raisin and really, and it's just like, it's focus on yourself. That is the sphere of influence right here. You can't do anything beyond that. Right? And people feel totally powerless. Like if you look at Black Lives Matter, you know, people were initially really talking about material stuff, material inequalities, like this frustration of getting left out and spat out the bottom of the system, expressed through a kind of racialized discourse of difference, but that I think a lot of people feel. And that is the basis for like a movement for material change that can be very dangerous. But at the same time, people also feel that that's not really where we can make a change. We feel totally disempowered when it comes to actually materially making our lives better. We've been busted down so many times. Unions are not the force that they used to be. In fact, they're much more likely to hand you like a well-being badge and tell you to breathe. Depends. I hate to say too much negative. I've been disappointed by unions, but also they're awesome people who do fantastic union organizing and some really good, strong unions. But in comparison to how they used to be, like no comparison. So that movement, particularly in the United States, dead. And so we're powerless and yet frustrated. So where does it get funneled? It gets funneled to symbols. And there's a very good book. One of my favorite books is by Joseph Gusfield called Symbolic Crusade, which was published like 50 years ago, I think, and it's on the American temperance movement. But it's a fantastic book where he talks about, he says, you know, why were people who didn't drink themselves so obsessed with other people's drinking? And he says, because they want their values to be recognized as the values of the culture. And that's all they really can do, because he says after movements for material politics have waned already by the 50s, you know, like Daniel Bell declared like the end of ideology in the 50s. And you can see like the sense of exhaustion in the 50s around politics even then. But he says after material politics dies, the realm of symbolic politics becomes very powerful. And so we all of our frustrations, all of our power gets funneled into symbols. And I find it very interesting that Black Lives Matter evolved into a movement about symbols, because that's where we have agency. I can't ensure that I've got a job for life, never mind a job tomorrow. But I can tear down a statue. And the powers that be will be like, you know, they'll be on board for something like that, because it's not taking over a factory, right? And I'm not blaming people, because that movement is gone. Like how do you, it's so confused in the culture. Like, yes, I want more, I want a better life. But at the same time, I'm constantly told you shouldn't want more. That's bad for you and bad for your soul. So I think that's become a really sort of powerful thing, that our sort of material not only just our material understandings, but our ability to affect the world materially has waned. And this gets expressed through symbolic and obsession with symbols. So I think that's become very powerful. I lost the train of the thread to your question, though. Would you mind sort of repeating the question?
No, it did fit the question. My question was how, against the backdrop of what you just described, how to reactivate sociological reasoning, a sociological instead of individualistic, biologistic, psychologistic vision of human life and politics, for that matter.
Yeah. So when you're told that what is actually a very depoliticized formation is the be-all and the end-all of politics, say no. We must understand the economic base of our lives. Not, by the way, not everybody needs to understand this. Some people fight, some people are fought for. I'm not like gonna get mad at people for not reading Marx. Like, I often picture like Che Guevara going out to the countryside talking to peasants and like being so empathetic. And now these days it'd be like, but are you a bit racist? Should I be fighting for you? No, I'm not here to like reform people's subjectivity. But I think that there has to be a movement in society that is dedicated to understanding the deep economic structures of our problems, and that fights against attempts to say, no, that's not what you should be worried about. Really, we're just talking about mental health here. Really, we're just talking about happiness here. Just take the Buddha pill, whatever. Take this little bit, and that's all that you should care about. Let's talk about language. Let's talk about symbols, which is a bit ironic for somebody who talks quite a lot about language and symbols myself, that I don't think that language and symbols should be the be-all and end-all of our politics, because when I study language and rhetoric and discourse, I'm trying to drill down to something. I'm trying to find, I'm not saying that, it's a bit like when people used to deconstruct like Disney movies, you weren't saying like Disney was causing these things in the culture. You think that they were reflecting something in the culture, that they were like a mirror of the culture, and by deconstructing them we could understand something about the culture. And it's become like culture has become causal, where we're saying like, oh, if we could just get rid of all these Disney movies that have all these bad things in them, then somehow, some way, problems will dissolve. The culture becomes like a magical solution. That's not why I do discourse analysis. I'm trying to get down to like, why are we talking about the world in this way? What are we really talking about here? And I think that people are empirical even when they're wrong. Like, I think a lot of these happiness people, claims makers and happiness economists and degrowth people, I think they are seeing something real in the world. And they are trying to explain it. Just like John Stuart Mill saw something real, and smart guy, he knew what was going on in terms of the economy, but he thought that capitalism was the be-all and the end-all. And so when he saw that capitalism was coming up against a crisis in profitability, he harmonized it. He said it's a harmonious stationary state to which capitalism is naturally tending. And that's what I think people are trying to do. They see something happening in the world, they're looking at the data, and they see that there is a problem here. There's a lot, we're coming up against limits to growth, and they harmonize it and naturalize it. And they see it as a natural thing, and human beings, we need to attenuate ourselves to. Whereas Marx, who had an understanding of history that was much more forward-looking and far-reaching beyond this economic base, he didn't naturalize it. He said, look, capitalism is holding us back. It's coming up against fetters, just like economic systems had done in the past. Feudalism was coming up against the fetters of feudalism, and capitalism burst through. Now capitalism is being fettered, it's being held back. What is going to burst through? Well, Marx said communism. That didn't happen. But we're trying to I'm trying to kind of understand those fetters, and I think other people are trying to understand that too, but they're just doing it within a naturalized framework because they see this as the end of everything. And I think this actually goes back very, very far. And what I find very interesting is that there's always been this attempt to naturalize and harmonize the contradictions of capitalism as though they are the outgrowth of human beings. I think we see this now in overdrive, because at least in the past, there was a movement that used to that said, no, this is not the end of history. In the 1930s, you had, Vilfredo Pareto died before this, but you had people like Vilfredo Pareto who were saying, this is, capitalism is just an outgrowth of human nature and so on. And whatever problems exist, they are simply the reflection of human traits, internal psychological processes and so on. You had that. And you also had movements that said, no, the reason why we cannot have freedom, the freedoms that we are promised in this system, is because the base of the system itself will not allow it. It is premised on inequality. We have an ideology of equality that is premised on a base of inequality. We will never, ever get there so long as we have capitalism. All right, let's move beyond capitalism. You had like the Spanish Civil War and so on. And you had like people who were still kind of fighting for this. Now that's gone. And what do we see? The ideology of Vilfredo Pareto is generalized. Everybody thinks that if there are problems, they're just outgrowths of human beings. And Daniel, you'll remember when you came to visit, we went and talked to a bunch of sociologists.
Mm.
Remember, we were criticizing this. And when we finished talking, they looked at us blankly and they said, well, what do you want us to look at? You want us to study the soul? These were sociologists. They couldn't understand that you don't start at the individual and work out to understand social problems. Start outside. It's a dialectic. It's a back and forth. But they thought when we were criticizing the tendency to look at individual psychological traits and to go up to social problems from there, they thought we wanted to look deeper inside. That's where we are as a culture.
Oh, yes, quite. I certainly agree with that. And I think of your recent work that reflects this, actually work which we've done together concerns the cultural preoccupation with mindfulness that's taken deep roots in Western societies, for example, in the UK. So what led you to take an interest in mindfulness, and how does mindfulness fit in the scenario you've just described?
So I noticed that a new kind of discourse was making its way into the headlines, was, the title of best-selling books and so on. And so that kind of, pricked up my ears. So my current book is looking at the way that these kind of fads will give way to a new fad. And so I decided to study mindfulness and see how it relates to these earlier discourses that I was studying, like happiness and well-being. And after I looked at mindfulness, I then started to look at mental health. And so my interest was, it's the exact same kind of problem formation that we see going from self-esteem to happiness, situates individuals at the heart of social problems. What I found very interesting when I thought it was the same thing. I thought it was this conversation being had again. And actually I wrote a chapter for a handbook, Global Therapeutic Cultures, where I called it Cycles. And I'm starting to think now it's not quite a cycle, because cycle implies an indefinite repetition, just forever and ever keep doing this. It's not the same. I think there's like dialectic. There's this these problems, they come together and they become something else. And I think that this is what's happened with happiness and well-being and mental health. Mental health isn't just a cycle, it's a sublation. It is like something total, something new that's come out that is a much deeper problematization of the self. But I think mindfulness is a step on that way, because what was interesting about the mindfulness discourse when I began to study it was that, unlike self-esteem, so self-esteem would say, like, we will solve social problems, we will end teenage pregnancy, they had this humongous list of social problems that they would solve. But mindfulness was much more ambivalent. They did promise to solve a huge range of problems, but at the same time, they would often explicitly say, this isn't a panacea. They would say this all the time, this isn't a panacea. And I think this is partially a result of previous flack from other movements, like happiness is a panacea and so on. But I think that there's a certain amount of pessimism that's also expressed, where it's like, we're actually not going to change the world. We're actually not going to solve problems, but we can feel a little better. And that, that really struck me. At least self-esteem had some kind of optimism. They were wrong. Self-esteem could not possibly solve the problems they claimed they could solve, because the reason why we have teenage pregnancy is not, it's also questionable whether or not the age at which a woman has her baby is a social problem. But anyway, the reason why that happens is not because of low self-esteem. It's not feeling inside of you, right? It's to do with all sorts of factors. Why at the age at which a woman has her child, it's not totally an individual thing. So it couldn't possibly do that, couldn't live up to its promises, but at least it made them. At least it had that kind of optimism. Now there's this pessimism, and that's what I find very interesting. It's that sphere of change, it's getting smaller and smaller. In each iteration, what the individual has control over gets smaller. And with mindfulness, one thing that I found very interesting is that the individual almost has no control at all, even over their own mind. The way that they talk about people, it's like everything is disordered, and it's couched in this very like progressive, empathetic language. It was like, me too, I too am disordered. It's all these people in power sitting there talking about how they have no control over their minds, which is pretty funny. And that's like meant to be like a progressive thing, which, by the way, was an insult that they used to hurl at women and ethnic minorities as a reason for why they were unsuited for the public sphere. You're too close to your emotions, you're ruled by your emotions, you're able to reflect and act in the proper ways. And, you know, we can't have a woman president because, you know, when she's PMSing, you know, all of that nonsense that they would say about particular groups. Now that's generalized. It's not that we've said, actually, all human beings have the capacity to reflect. And just with that, like, just by virtue of being in the world and realizing, coming up against problems and trying to solve them, it's, yes, okay, some people may be able to have this capacity to reflect if you have the right interventions, if you do the right thing, if you buy the right books, if you take my training program and so on. But actually, the natural state of all human beings is disordered, vulnerable, incapable of making sense of things without some kind of external intervention. So what we've actually done is we've democratized what was a very insulting view of women and minorities in the past to everybody. And the path out is supposed to be through recourse to these technologies that experts and so on have developed. So they have this access to this kind of special thing. And the interesting thing is that previous discourses as well had the expert who was more or less like you and me. So through learning about self-esteem, and it's always the same, these kind of like conceptual entrepreneurs or self-help entrepreneurs, self-help entrepreneurs. It's always the same. They always have this like light bulb moment where they see the light and so on, and they become the expert that can guide everybody to reason. But what I find very interesting is that mindfulness has more of like so that's kind of like an enlightenment understanding, right? I find that mindfulness has more of a romanticism to it that is a little regressive in comparison, because a lot of the flack would be, oh, but this isn't a true master, right? That the true thing is Buddhist and so on, and it's like you can't really have access to that knowledge unless you're really part of that culture, unless you're really like you are a member of that religion, unless you have that like true spiritual kind of enlightenment. And it's kind of questionable how much white people or like non-members of that culture are able to live up to that. And I find that very interesting, because that is like a kind of like anti-humanist kind of form of self-help entrepreneur. So we like, it's got to be, you know, the Dalai Lama, or else it's no good, like the chosen one, right? And I find that very interesting as well, that there's it's a lot less optimistic, it's a lot less neoliberal, and I think that's what's different, that there's, in each iteration we become more and more pessimistic about human subjectivity.
However, and this is something which I'm genuinely wondering about, by framing the mindfulness fad in such complex terms, aren't we giving it too much credit? Because in the end, there's a big distinction to be made between public intellectuals and what we in our work have called self-help entrepreneurs, who may be academics, who may be scholars, but who are also people who intervene in public life also, or perhaps primarily, by wanting to sell you something, a mindfulness course, a self-help course, self-help book, whichever kind of mindfulness related product or service. Now, it sounds rather cynical, but don't we give something which in the end may be an intellectually not very sophisticated set of ideas anymore too much credit by framing it in the way in which you've just done, in which we done it together in our publications? Or am I being too cynical about it?
I didn't mean to give them too much credit. It came across that way, my mistake. No, I I don't know, because they will claim a lot of sophistication, right? And sometimes it's hilariously stupid, like some of the claims that are made, you have to laugh. But sometimes, you know, there's a lot of, I think, misguided but pretty good scholarship.
Of course,
Even,
of course, of course. There's very good scholarship on the one hand, but there's also the distilled down version in the form of whatever Mindfulness for Dummies, or what Ronald Purser in his critique of mindfulness has called Mac mindfulness. So I wonder whether that deserves close intellectual scrutiny or recognition.
No, I think they're distilling the mystical kernel. They're distilling, like mindfulness distills exactly what is wrong with mindfulness in general. That's the thing. That the more sophisticated versions have the same problems. So when I look at, that's why I said I think they're sophisticated, but they're wrong. Even like some of the criticisms that will say like, no, it's become too individualistic, we need to have some kind of social mindfulness. Well, still the focus is you yourself, that change must start at the individual. Be the change you want to see in the world. That ultimately the reason why we have problems is lack of awareness or something. And if only we had a critical mass of awareness, then all problems will be solved. Awareness that there exist problems. But in order for awareness that there exist problems to progress into changing the world, you need to understand the world. Like, and that is what we do. You don't need to sit on a prayer mat or buy someone's 10 steps to a mindful you. You know, like slaves didn't need mindfulness. They didn't need psychology. They needed liberation, you know, and we're just constantly putting, like, you know what it reminds me of? Have you ever read Huckleberry Finn?
Yes, of course.
Do you know when Jim is like, I can't remember, I read this obviously as a child, but when Jim is, I think he's like locked somewhere, and the kids are trying to free him, and they're like, well, they're living in this adventure, because for them the problem's not really real. The problems are not as real as it is for Jim. And they're like, well, they go and get knives, and they're like, we'll dig them out with knives. And they try to drag it out for as long as possible. And they're like, and we'll pass the freeing Jim on to our children. And Jim is like, kids, I need to get out of here. And that's what it reminds me of. Like, we have to have, like, make this space between problem and us, like, as complicated as possible, because we have exhausted all of our previous attempts to deal with issues. So it's got to be like, and this is self-esteem did the exact same thing. So we come up against this exhaustion, this wall, and we're like, well, if only women could just, you know, like develop more self-confidence and efficacy, somehow, some way we'll be able to jump over it. And it's like we come up against a wall with dealing with material problems, and so we turn around on the self and we say, well, somehow, some way, if I just change you, if I just fix you, then you'll be well enough to fix the world. And it gives us something to do because we don't know what to do. We have no idea how to solve problems. We've been completely, like, that complex machinery of Marxism is gone. We're basically trying to solve problems and understand the world with both our hands tied behind our backs. We're not able to really draw on history. We're not able to have like a totalizing discourse, right? Any kind of totalizing understanding of issues is beyond the pale. And so what's left? Be the change you want to see in the world. And you know, this sort of magical solutions. If only we could change the way people think, feel, and behave, somehow, some way, the problems would disappear. And it's across the political spectrum. It's, you know, people on the right feel the same way. If only we could change the way the poor think, feel, and behave, we wouldn't have this pesky poverty and all these people angry at us. You know, just stop them from having kids at a certain age and so on. And the left, totally bereft of ideology and ideas, has totally jumped on that bandwagon. Just completely think that early interventions are going to solve all social problems and so on. Everything is starting from the individual.
Yes, very much. And this notion of cultural and political exhaustion is certainly also something that came to my mind when I was listening to you just now. So how does your very latest research fit into all this? By this I mean your most recent article, which is titled Supporting the Sacred Journey, Causal Stories and the Problem of Indigenous Parenting. That's shift in topic from your previous research. So could you explain a little bit about this most recent publication of yours and how it fits all these concerns that we've just been discussing?
Yeah, it's not really a shift in topic, actually. It seems that way. But I went to a conference in 2013 with my aunt, an Indigenous kind of conference, Indigenous Information Governance. And it's about, just Indigenous people just getting sick of being poked and prodded and studied and seen as problems. And a little bit of pushback, like, if you're going to study us, we want that data and we want it to actually make our lives better. So that's what that conference was about, which is very empowering, very much about self-determination and agency and so on. And what I noticed as I was sitting through these sessions was these people just like coming and they're like, oh yeah, people don't want to be studied anymore. So they're trying to find, and they don't want to be they distrust social workers and so on. And they're just trying to find more and more creative ways to do it anyway. Because they're just so damn convinced that the problems in Indigenous communities are between our ears. They're just so convinced that we're bad parents. And I was just, and I was sick of it. I was sick of sitting there listening to this and just the way that it was talked about in this like caring language when they were basically repeating old colonialist tropes. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's basically like through this very like kind, and colonialism did the same thing. They claimed that they were being caring too. And they were basically saying like, it's not your fault, you can't be mothers. And even my aunt said to me, she said something like, oh, it's the parents, it's our parenting, we never really learned how to be parent. And I was like, there's no damn infrastructure on reserves. There are real material issues that people have tried to solve many times over and haven't been able to solve. It's a wicked issue. It's bloody difficult. Nobody knows exactly how to overcome these issues because you can't have like integration into culture, into the broader culture, but you also can't have reserves that are like islands in the middle of nowhere. And so we're like stuck between past and future. It's an incredibly difficult problem. A lot of people on reserves are, like for the outside world, for Canada, Indigenous people are like these little symbols that they like to hold up and claim moral superiority through. But if you actually talk to people like on reserves, like my cousins or my brother, for example, he's like pro pipeline, pro oil pipeline, because he wants a job. He wants his life to be materially better. And so that's an issue. It's a big problem. And we have this enormous sort of deflection activity because we've attempted to solve these material problems many times over and have failed. And it's incredibly touchy and difficult. And so what we wind up with is this obsession with individuals and individual lives. And it's crazy because material improvement is cast as colonization, but literally colonizing people's heads and telling them how to think and feel and behave is portrayed as decolonization. And so I was watching this in this conference and I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. And so I looked at some of their materials and some of the materials that these groups in that conference were producing. And then that led me to some different documents. And it was basically colonialism cast as decolonialism. And I thought that is really interesting. So I analyzed these documents. I did a sort of discursive analysis and looking at causal stories. So that is what stories are told about the problems that exist on reserves, but also what causes them. And you see that the most common, so like a causal story contains both like a reason why things are wrong, but also a mechanism that assigns blame. And what I found was that the number one reason portrayed in these documents was the past of colonialism, past colonial government, not the current one. They've realized the errors of their ways. Everything's in the past. And it was through colonial disruption that they disrupted the continuity of cultural transmission between generations. And now we have problems. So explicitly, it's the past government's fault. But implicitly, whose fault is it? It's parents, right? Because they've had cultural disruption. They lost the thread to their parents, who would have taught them how to raise children. And now they're unable to parent their own children. Now, this is an exact replication of a very powerful discourse that exists in the broader culture. Why do working class people have social problems? It's the parents. How do we solve social problems? Social engineering. We go into the schools, we try to get people to be, or we get people to be better parents in all these different ways. And that's the only way to solve problems, because we don't know, we've completely lost the ability to understand, you know, class society and how it's reproduced. We think it's individuals that are doing it. Anyway, so it's the exact same discourse, but expressed through this kind of historical legacy of colonialism. And the implicit blame is parents. So it's exactly the same with colonialism. They said Indigenous mothers were incapable of producing liberal subjects capable of being Canadian citizens. Well, it's the same thing now. It's the exact same thing, except, oh, we're very sorry, it's our fault in the past, and that's why we now have to go in and pick up the pieces. And by going in and picking up the pieces, so we look at the conclusions, what did these documents say needs to be done? We need to go in and prop up people's culture and empower people and give people the strength to be better parents, build their confidence, build their self-esteem, and re-impute their culture through cultural renewal. But what is cultural renewal? Cultural renewal is basically a globalization. So that's a portmanteau of globalization and localization, which I've taken from literature that I think you also draw on in your work, which is basically they translate broader Anglo-American discourses of parenting into Indigenous language. So in the broader culture, there's an obsession with the first 3 years, even pre-pregnancy. So like surveillance of women even before they get pregnant. There's that obsession in the broader culture. That gets then translated into Indigenous cultural forms. So that in one of the documents, there was this medicine wheel with the 4 directions. And they transpose over the 4 directions, like preconception all the way to parenting. And it's exactly the same as it's the exact same discourse as the broader culture, but they portray it as a rejuvenation of Indigenous culture. So it's colonization, but it's what some scholars have called deep colonization. So it's portrayed as decolonization, but it is through a neo-colonialist discourse that is very kind sounding, very caring sounding, and is meant to bring subjects on side, and actually even to enlist them in their own domination. And now the thing is, like, I'm also not against what would have been considered colonization in the past, which is development and infrastructure. But that is so touchy, so touchy. And I just think that if you are looking at social problems within a particular community, you must look at the material base of those problems. And we are not able to do that. And so we engage in these kind of deflection activities onto individuals and think that through the reform of subjectivity, magically, some way, somehow we will solve these problems. And what winds up happening is that those problems are not solved. But instead of thinking, well, maybe it's because our solution and our understanding of the problem is wrong, we actually deepen the problem of subjectivity. We actually become more convinced of the complete unreformability, that's a word, of the Indigenous subject. They're so messed up. There's something so wrong with their heads. They're so traumatized. They can't be good subjects. They can't be good citizens. So we actually degrade the subject even more instead of thinking, maybe we got it wrong in the first place.
Yes, and I think that what you've just described reflects, on the one hand, long-standing and deep-seated political patterns in colonial and post-colonial societies all across the Americas, not just in Canada, but also the sense of cultural and political exhaustion that we've talked about before, the idea that broader material political solutions are not imaginable or not available anymore, and therefore we only have recourse to the kinds of interventions that you've described in your work.
In many cases, they're not possible either. Like, I think that some problems can't be solved within capitalism. And instead of realizing that, we become more and more convinced that it's people that are the problem. And then we slip into this really misanthropic kind of discourse where we become more and more convinced of the weakness of the human subject. more and more desperate and more open to be self-help entrepreneurs and so on, who will come in and promise us the solution to our disordered heads. And we just become more and more defeated. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we truly believe that. We truly believe that that's how human beings are. I used to believe that too. The idea that the subject can be open, can be different, can change depending on the context and the circumstances is just gone. We now have a very determined subject. And in each iteration, that's why I said it, I'm not thinking of it as so much a cycle anymore, because in each iteration, that subject becomes more problematized. The human subject becomes more degraded. We become more pessimistic. And even like Marxists, who historically have been the most anti-Malthusian kind of people, have now started to gravitate toward Malthusian ideas. And I think that's a real sign that we're losing hope.
Yes.
We're losing a sense that we can't understand the world through reason and change it.
Yes, quite. And I think it's precisely this which makes your work and our area of scholarship really important. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you for this very interesting conversation and conclude this interview. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right.